Good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We are recording tonight's webinar, so if for some reason it gets cut short for technical difficulties, or you want to come back and watch it or share it with your friends, we have that for you guys. You should see popping up on your screen here in just 1 second a pre-event like survey kind of poll thing. And this just kind of helps us gauge the efficacy of our programs and allows us to improve and continue providing educational opportunities. We will also have an optional exit survey at the end of our event tonight. My name is Olivia, and I'm an AmeriCorps member with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. This program aims to improve stewardship of Nebraska's natural resources by increasing knowledge and concern for the most important conservation issues facing our state. To make this happen, our focus is on providing volunteer opportunities, engaging community members, and continually improving local conservation practices, and providing educational opportunities like this webinar. Tonight, we will be learning how hunting is again an integral part of conservation, especially in North America. Specifically tonight, we'll be focusing on the waterfowl aspect. And we have with us Dr. Mark Vrtiska, who is currently a professor of practice at UNL, and previously he was the Waterfowl Program Manager at Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. He was also a regional biologist for Ducks Unlimited, and he earned his, sorry, my computer's glitching. Right at the beginning, right? Isn't that how it always goes? He's got his, there it goes. Bachelor's of Science in Ag from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and a Master's of Science in Biology from Eastern Kentucky, and his PhD in Wildlife Ecology from Mississippi State University. His interests include all aspects of waterfowl ecology and management, including human-hunter interactions with waterfowl and wetland conservation and management. Before I hand it over to Dr. Vrtiska, I just want to remind all participants that mics are muted and we cannot see you. While we do have a few poll questions, like I did mention, we will have some time for Q&A at the end, but we will also try and answer questions as we go throughout whenever we get an organic break. The chat function will remain open for that, so if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in there at any time. And I will hand it over to Dr. Vrtiska.
All right, thank you, Olivia, for that introduction. And technically speaking, since you took my course, you probably could give this. And so that was my backup if something happened on the way in, that you would just be able to do it yourself. So I thank everybody. Yeah, I thank everybody for attending tonight, and we'll kind of jump right into it here. As Olivia mentioned, what we're going to talk about tonight is waterfowl participation, and kind of looking at some things in terms of what does that future hold for not only kind of Nebraska, but we're looking at more of a national level. And really, when you're talking waterfowl hunting or waterfowl, they're migratory birds. And so one of the things that you kind of always, that I always think of, it's just not a Nebraska thing. It kind of goes up and down flyways and across flyways. And that's kind of the unique thing about migratory birds. And again, I think a couple of weeks ago, if you tuned in, Jackson Ellis with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission talked a little bit about the decline in hunters overall. And I highlighted kind of the top thing that he talked about there was that, you know, in the US, we've lost nearly 5 million hunters here, kind of over the last decade, and for a variety of reasons. And so again, that decline is kind of what we're also seeing in the waterfowl world, and we'll kind of go a little bit more in depth on that. And also coming from Jackson's presentation, he did cover, you know, kind of what those ramifications of the importance of hunters to conservation, and why we need hunters out there in the field. And I'll probably circle back to a lot of this at some point here in the presentation, and kind of maybe with a more of a waterfowl bent to it. And one of the things when we're looking at this kind of came back from several years ago from a study I did with some colleagues from other states, and where we looked at kind of this very thing. What's going to happen, or what has happened with kind of this decline in waterfowl hunters? What does that mean, and what has that done? in terms of conservation. And so we took a little bit more of a formal look at it again several years ago. And I was kind of looking at this when putting this presentation together, thinking, man, we're going to have to update this thing here in a few years, which we'll be glad to do. But again, this is a kind of one of those studies that documented kind of what we were looking at and what the impacts have been. And this kind of, when you set the stage for some of this, and in the waterfowl world, which you kind of always want to, or what always has been done, is kind of revert back to quote the Bible, if you will, and that's the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And when you look at this plan that originated way back in 1986, there was a goal in there for this plan that stated, mainly what the plan was going to do was to maintain populations of ducks and their habitats, and at a certain level, people can use and enjoy them. And really the main focus, when you kind of look at that goal statement, it really is focused on ducks and habitats. And when you think back to 1986, and we'll kind of maybe see this a little bit graphically later, that was a time when duck populations and habitats weren't doing so well. And so that probably was the appropriate focus at that time, was to look at that in terms of that goal statement. And that goal statement pretty much stayed in place, and this plan's been updated multiple times. And that goal statement kind of just carried through those updates all the way to about 2011. So almost 20 years, that was the same goal statement in there. And there wasn't a lot of discussion about changing that. Well, kind of after that point in time, or during that point in time too, when you stop and think what things had been in terms of regulations, habitat, and all this sort of thing, and especially in the regulatory world, what you were looking at is a lot of effort, a lot of research, monitoring program, everything on waterfowl populations. And there was actually very little done on anything in terms of human hunter preferences or opinions, behaviors, anything of that nature in terms of what we call human dimensions work. So we probably, and as some biologists I've heard state, probably at some point in time, we know more about the mallard than some countries know about their people. Well, that was probably the case. And in terms of, if you look at it from the waterfowl world, we knew a lot about ducks and geese, but we really didn't know a whole heck of a lot about hunters. And there was some initial survey work done actually in 96, but the big survey that I'm referring to here was done in 2005, where it was the very first time on a national level that waterfowl managers surveyed waterfowl hunters across the U.S. and got their opinions, preferences, satisfaction levels, a whole bunch of different parameters that we had never obtained before. And probably a couple of years later after that, there was a big meeting in Minneapolis that kind of started talking about, where we're going to go in the waterfowl world, and kind of setting up the next update for the waterfowl plan, NAWAMP plan. And so what we were seeing here is that there is this kind of reckoning, if you will, that while duck populations and duck habitat are still critically important, there's this third element out there, and that's the duck hunter, or the people that care about wetland conservation, that we really need to start paying attention to. And with that, in 2012, what happened was that everything before that, again, were updates. There was an update to NAWAMP plan, kind of looking at where we'd been, habitat goals achieved or not achieved. But this one was kind of a revision, and kind of going back and seeing how we were doing on these sorts of things. And there were a couple main points that came out of that. And one of them, again, was looking at how we're going to integrate waterfowl populations with habitat with the hunters, or the people component. And with that, and as you can see highlighted, one of the big new goals, and this is really kind of unique in the wildlife management field, was there was actually a new goal included in the NAWANT plan in 2012 that included a focus on people. And more specifically, if you want to look at the goals from that NAWANT plan, again, you're still looking at populations and habitats. But again, that third one that's highlighted, and again, I will say again and reiterate, this is pretty unique in terms of the wildlife management field, where you're actually having a goal in a national plan that's identifying people and specifically waterfowl hunters, as well as other individuals, in terms of them supporting waterfowl and wetlands conservation. So again, kind of a first in terms of where we're headed in the direction of this plan and what it means. And again, recognizing there's that kind of component. And the other thing that really came out of there to me that I think we all knew at some point, but through the discussions of this revision, we came up, or it kind of came real evident that these things are interconnected. That to have strong waterfowl populations, you need a lot of good waterfowl habitat. And one way you get that waterfowl habitat is by hunters and other conservationists providing that habitat, which again helps drive waterfowl populations. So they're interconnected. And there's some other things you can see on the outside of that are a little bit larger than just the waterfowl world, which we recognize that the benefits of doing habitat conservation and things for waterfowl benefit a lot of other things a lot larger than just ducks. So those were some key things that had come out in the waterfowl world and in this 2012 North American Waterfowl Management Plan. They really started kicking some stuff off. And again, referring back to that study, one thing that had not really been documented or really looked at was kind of this relationship between duck populations and duck stamp sales. And so basically what you're looking at here is a graph kind of on the, at least on the same scale that you can put it on. Hunters are on the left and duck populations are on the right. And what we're looking at here is kind of that trend of duck stamp sales, or i.e., if you will, hunter numbers from 1955 and how that compared to duck populations at that time all the way to 2008. But what we did is broke it down into two segments between 1955 and 1993, and then or 94, excuse me, and then 1995 to 2008. And again, what were the differences that we were seeing? And if you look at this graph, you can probably see it looks like at some point there in the late 80s, early 90s, that these lines start diverging a little bit. And again, me and my colleagues being a little bit having to put numbers to it. When you look at the relationship, and this is just a very simple kind of regression or correlation, which helps quantify this relationship between duck stamps or hunter numbers and the breeding populations. If you look at that first time period here in 90 or 55 to 94, if you're not familiar with statistics at all, when you have a correlation, it ranges from 0 to 1. And if it's 0 means that there's absolutely no relationship. If it's 1, it means it's a very strong or perfect relationship. Well, as you can see in 55 to 94, you have an R value of 0.81, which signifies again that the relationship between hunter numbers and duck populations was very, very strong. And if we go back up and look at our graph, you can kind of see this. It really doesn't need statistics to it, but you can see how these lines just basically track all the way. And again, when we look at this later period, though, what we found was that our correlation between numbers of hunters and duck populations has kind of come apart a little bit. And again, when you go back in and look at this graph, you can see that again, that we've all of a sudden developed this pretty big gap in here. And these lines are not tracking each other very well. Now there's still some correlation in there, 0.29, but you can see how much it's changed between these two time periods, which is pretty disconcerting. And really what we did in that paper in our study is kind of then said, well, what would have happened had that relationship maintained? So if you kind of look at it, and this is, kind of just drawn in here, but if this line or this relationship would have held through the 95 to 2008 time period, what would we have seen in terms of conservation? And this is where you start looking at it. And again, when you look at the numbers, just from the federal duck stamp only, this is every waterfowl hunter age 16 years of age or older has to purchase a federal duck stamp. And just from that federal duck stamp, we had lost $126 million in revenue just in that relatively short time frame. And what that would have done had you been able to take that money, and let's just say we use South Dakota as an example of where these funds could have been spent. We could have saved 42,500 hectares of wetlands and associated uplands. If you don't know what a hectare is, you're looking at about 105,000 acres, 105,000 acres, which is probably about the size. I'm trying to think if anybody out there is familiar with like Valentine Refuge. Valentine Refuge is 76,000 acres, I believe. And maybe it'd be about the size of Crescent Lake National Wildlife Refuge out there north of Ogallala. And that's just an acquisition. If you would have taken all that money and put it in acquisition, a lot of that money is used for wetland and grassland easements, meaning that conservation organizations take the money, put an easement on that property. It's still retained in private ownership, but the development and conversion to any kind of agriculture is prohibited. You would have saved even more habitat out there on the landscape. So the bottom line is that had that relationship maintained, we would have had and currently would have right now a lot more habitat on the ground and would still be having that habitat on the ground. And again, I want to reiterate, that's just from the federal duck stamp. It's not from the purchase of the Nebraska duck stamp or any other duck stamps out there that also would have contributed to habitat conservation. So where are we at now? Well, if you kind of look at this last period since then, when we look at probably the last 10 years that we have data for with the duck stamp, we've seen that relationship maybe come back a little bit in terms of its relationship, in terms of how those numbers track to each other, which is somewhat encouraging. But if you notice, there's still a pretty big gap in here of where those are at. And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit tonight too. So if numbers are starting to come back and it looks like hunter numbers have kind of evened out a little bit, is there really anything to worry about? And I hear that a little bit from individuals. It's like, look, man, if you look at the duck stamps, we're not, they're not just continually going down. We're seeing them track a little bit. Do I need to worry? Well, the way I look at it is, yeah, first of all, yes, we still do. Again, when we look at these lines, there's still a gap there. And what that means, again, is that loss in conservation funding. And again, if you just want to look at it from a federal duck standpoint, we're still losing conservation funding. We're still not protecting a lot of habitat out there on the landscape. And so, again, we still have it out here. If you look to the right, again, what you'd rather see is the gap being closed like this, not like this. And so for the last 10 years, from 2009 to 2019, again, we probably lost another 100-some million, and maybe even a little bit more since the price of the duck stamps went up to $25. So we've lost, again, that potential to save habitat for waterfowl. The other thing in terms that still has me worried is that the waterfowl hunter demographics. And this is something that the one thing that I always and have caught from duck hunters, duck hunters don't want to see another duck hunter is kind of what the bottom line is. And so I get this where, well, we really don't need more waterfowl hunters out there. We've got enough, or it's too crowded already, or something along those lines. And yet what I'm seeing in some of the data, again, is making me worried. And what this is right here, what you're seeing graph is, this is for Nebraska state. This is for Nebraska combo permits. So, or all permits purchased. I'm trying to think how this is quantified, but it is hunting permits are included in this. And some of these here on the end at 65, you get I think the combo permit for a little bit cheaper price. And what you're seeing here is a kind of a graph, and what you're seeing, and you notice this little kind of peak here near the end. And again, a lot of that's driven by that age 65 or older combo permit that's there. But if you're looking at this, if you want to know who these people are, they're the baby boomers. So what we have currently in the demographics of at least individuals in Nebraska and a lot of other places across the US is this baby boomer generation is kind of getting to that point of at the end of permit purchasing. And when we look at the proportion of the baby boomers and kind of right now in the generations out there, they're still basically about the largest component out there in terms of a population, in terms of a generation. And right now, and I'm on the tail end of this baby boomer generation myself, what we're looking at again is this range where the oldest are about approximately 75 years of age. Well, what does that mean? Well, again, if we go back to this graphic and look at some of these, and again, we kind of look at this downward trend, both in duck numbers and duck populations. And again, as duck numbers fell from the drought, so did duck stamp sales. What occurred here, and probably why this line didn't bounce back up to a large extent, if that opportunity in terms of duck hunting, not seeing ducks, restrictive regulations, and a few other things, what happened, just given their age and so forth at this approximate time period, what we seen is those individuals that were of the greatest generation, or those that, or for a lot of them were around for World War II or participated in World War II, started dropping out in pretty big numbers. And when you look at the peak of waterfowl hunter numbers back here in the early 70s, what you had here is kind of this coupling really of these World War II veterans and probably their children participating in waterfowl hunters. So you had this greatest generation as well as the baby boomer generation. And that's why we had such a peak, as well as a peak in waterfowl hunter or waterfowl populations. But again, what we've seen is this drop and this dropping out from these individuals. Well, if we take it and look at this graph from today's current purchase or permit purchasing, you can see this kind of graph. And what we've been seeing, and you don't see it here as much because, again, this does include that fish and hunt combo. If you looked at just hunting participation, what we've seen in all these graphs is about when you begin about age 70 and probably about age 75, we see a dramatic drop in those individuals participating in purchasing hunting. And again, some of it's due to they're just too old to go out to actual, they're just not around anymore to actually even purchase a permit. So when you get to a certain age, and again, about 75 years of age, you really drop out of waterfowl hunting, and as well as a lot of other hunting forms. And so what we're going to see in this next decade, and this is what's kind of got me worried in a major way, is that the majority of baby boomers are going to be out of the hunting population. And when I look at that, it scares me in a couple ways, because again, there's a lot of tradition associated, and we'll talk about tradition with baby boomers and everybody. But I'm included in this. So and maybe not in 10 years, but may take me a little bit longer. But you're going to see a lot of the baby boomers dropping out, not only of waterfowl hunting, but a lot of other forms of hunting as well. The other thing that I see that's going to continue, I don't see anything changing here. And one thing that's had, again, kind of a detrimental effect on hunting in general, is that we've just kind of had this movement out of the rural areas into urban. And for most of the hunters, and waterfowl hunters included, what you're looking at are people that tend to be more rural, and they kind of grow up hunting, as probably, a lot of people listening in, that's probably how they got started. You're kind of in a rural area and somebody shows you where to go, and people that own land, so you go. And what we're seeing, I think, again, is this continual movement toward urban areas, which is going to make it more difficult for us to be able to kind of keep waterfowl hunting the numbers up. And there are a few other things. The one other thing that I'm seeing, and I'm a little bit worried about, is waterfowl populations themselves. And we actually seen this very year. Unfortunately, surveys that have been traditionally done weren't conducted this year. And I would have really liked to seen some of the numbers from this year, because it's one of the driest years we've seen on the prairies for quite a few years. And that drought is something we have not seen in quite a long period of time. And again, when we started looking at this drop in both duck populations followed by hunter numbers, this was the last bad drought stretch that we had, that period from about 1985 to 1993. And we saw some record lows in terms of duck populations during that time period, as well as, and that was a 20-year period from about 1962. And when you look at this graph, we've been about 20 years from that, or more actually right now at this point, and we haven't really faced the same kind of drought in these conditions. 2021 was a kind of this year that we were seeing it, and maybe a little bit in 2020. And it's a little bit disconcerting knowing that drought is going to occur, and it could be coming here very quickly. And what is that going to do? And even with a kind of not a strong relationship, probably what we're going to see is when we have this drought, and it's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's going to be a matter of when. What is that going to do to waterfowl hunter numbers? On top of that, we still have wetland drainage going on. We still have conversion of grasslands into cropland. Both of these kind of alone are like a 1-2 punch to duck populations that are hard to stop and hard to kind of mitigate for. And again, the best way is habitat conservation in some form or fashion that kind of helps protect wetlands from drainage as well as grasslands. But you have a whole myriad of other things going on. This is a shot from the boreal forest, and this is from oil fracking, pulling oil out of the ground in the boreal forest. And this is an immense retention pond. And I wish I could show a little bit bigger picture of this, but it kind of takes up the whole slide. But just to give you an idea, this little white dot right here is a pickup. So you can see the size of this, and this is in the boreal forest. This is up in the northern boreal forest, and some of this stuff is going on a large scale. Probably the other thing that is going to affect waterfowl in the next, and it probably actually has already started to a large extent. This is the Louisiana Coast. So New Orleans is about right in here. Baton Rouge, I think, is about right in here. What this red signifies is what we lost in coastal marsh. A lot of that, and we're going to lose more due to climate change and the rising of ocean levels. If you've ever been in this part of the world, it's extremely flat. So when you have even a small increase in the level of the ocean or the sea rise, you start losing a lot of marsh. And there's a lot of other things going on here in Louisiana in terms of coastal marsh loss that that in and of itself is a presentation, but climate change and the associated loss of coastal habitats in Louisiana, Texas, Atlantic coast, Pacific coast, and a lot of other places are going to change and alter the amount of habitat waterfowl have in during the wintering periods. And finally, this one is one that is really difficult to kind of provide data for or kind of tell people about, but just, and this is one of those things that, again, you have to almost experience to understand what's going on. But what we've seen in the last 20 years in waterfowl management is that we've just seen kind of this waning support from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And for those, if you're not aware, in terms of migratory birds and particularly waterfowl, you know, the one agency that has the overarching kind of decision making in terms of waterfowl regulations and a lot of other kind of push toward what happens with waterfowl is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so what I'm talking about here is kind of really and I'll kind of go through these and put them all up there. And it's not just the Fish and Wildlife Service as well, but I've seen it in the state agencies as well, is that because of these last 20, 30 years of pretty good duck populations, it's allowed, you know, not only the federal agencies, but also state agencies to kind of focus on other things. Things are good with waterfowl. We don't have to worry about them. We can just go and they seem to be taking care of themselves. And what we've seen and what I have seen personally is that in terms of budgets and staffing for migratory waterfowl have both decreased. If you look at just the state of Nebraska, at one point in the state of Nebraska, there were 3 individuals that were working on waterfowl related programs or monitoring programs. 3 people at one point in time. When I left a couple of years ago, I was the only individual that was a full-time employee working on waterfowl. And I've seen the same thing in the Fish and Wildlife Service. When I first started as a program manager at Game and Parks and going to flyway meetings, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service probably had 5 to 10 biologists working on waterfowl related programs. When I left, again, it was probably, you're looking at the top end of 5 people that were doing that sort of work. Again, so we've seen this shift, and there's a lot of conversations if you get into kind of the rooms that I had the privilege to be in, that this word of relevancy has become a big one in terms of waterfowl managers and the waterfowl management community. How can we maintain the support staff, all that sort of thing, and it's of a concern. So what we could be doing here, folks, is that we could be looking at a perfect storm if things kind of happen at the wrong time in the wrong place. And so if the drought hits when we're kind of in this same era as baby boomers going out, we could see a huge drop in waterfowl hunter numbers. It's just hard to predict. And I don't want to be scaring folks or, being chicken little here about what's going to happen, because again, it's relatively unknown. But it's just one of those things that if things kind of coincide, we could be looking at some major changes in waterfowl hunter numbers. Well, what does that mean? And the very first one, and I don't know how many individuals out there, are actually waterfowl hunters. To me, the one that always strikes me, and the one I like to bring up and talk about first, is this loss of tradition. I've always maintained that waterfowl hunting is the most social form of hunting we have. There are very few other opportunities where you can sit there and talk about things and do things in a duck blind that you can't do in the turkey woods. You can't do it while you're upland game bird hunting. You can't do it when you're in the deer stand. There's just a lot of social nature to waterfowl hunting, just kind of given how you do it. And when you have that social component, what you do is I think you build these traditions, you build these relationships with other people. And with that, you're in these places that you're all kind of connecting. And so there's this loss of tradition out there in terms of waterfowl hunting that you hate to see. And for those, I don't know, again, who's out there watching, the way I compare this is back when I was a kid growing up in Beatrice. The day I look forward to more than any at that point, and I was not a waterfowl hunter back in the day, and probably even I look more forward to pheasant season, the opening day of that, even more than Christmas. I think I'll be honest with you. I think I did. And if you recall, and I don't know how old everybody is on here. Olivia probably has no idea what I'm talking about here, but and that's fine. But what I recall for those days was that when you drive through the town of Beatrice the night before, you couldn't find a hotel or motel room. They were booked. You had multiple hunter breakfasts around town, and you had people in all the fields. There was a lot of non-residents in, and essentially it was an event. It was just a day. And most of you, again, probably have recognized what we've seen with pheasant numbers in Nebraska and what that's done. And that, I hate to say it, it's gone, and it's a part that we'll probably never get back, but it's just that loss of tradition. And it still kind of, makes you, nostalgic and all that. But I think there's more to be lost with that in terms of this social connection. And one thing about pheasant hunting that I always recalled was that you had a lot of times the same hunters coming back to hunt some of the same farms or going to the same farmsteads. And so you had non-residents coming into Nebraska, but connecting to Nebraskans here. And probably just as important is you had Nebraskans kind of leaving Lincoln, Omaha, or these metro areas and going back out to the family farm where they came from and going back pheasant hunting and connecting again. And what I think, and it's hard to measure, hard to put anything to it, but this social connection between Nebraskans with themselves and other people from other states has been lost to a great deal. And it's hard to put any kind of monetary thing to it, or I'm sure there's some social component you could probably, some HD expert could put to it, but something's been lost there. And again, even for me, just thinking about those days, you just kind of maybe even get watery eyed and start looking for a good glass of bourbon to think about those days. But just that's what I always compared to. And I would hate to see the same thing kind of happen with waterfowl hunting here in Nebraska, as well as anywhere else in the US. Probably the big thing, and again, probably reiterating a lot of things that Jackson said a couple of weeks ago, but what we're talking about here is, again, probably ultimately is this loss of habitat or conservation. And again, as I've already talked about, I'm not going to go into a whole lot more detail here, but we're going to still see this reduced amount of funding if some of these things happen with waterfowl hunter numbers, both at state and federal levels. And again, the bottom line to that is when we have reduced habitat conservation, what you're ultimately going to see is reduced waterfowl populations. And when you see that, you're going to see reduced waterfowl hunter numbers. So kind of that triangle, if you think about that again, and go around it, it's more of a circle now that once you start in this circle, it's kind of a feedback loop that kind of really hurts you in some ways. So again, we're going to see that potentially. Probably the other thing is when you have fewer people out there that can write congressmen or vote or anything like that, is what we're going to see is this reduced influence on any kind of important waterfowl or wetland conservation issue or measures. And that's, again, kind of difficult to measure, but it can have huge impacts. When you write your U.S. senator or congressman, that can have a lot of input and probably a lot more than people realize or give credit to. And I think it's a critical thing that we do need to think about. And what's kind of even worse here about this is in a recent survey, and this was just done a few years ago, and we asked people, waterfowl hunters, what did they do? Did they ever contact their elected officials, how they voted and their advocacy for political action? I was actually appalled when we got these results back in this survey, especially this one about contacting elected officials. Almost 75% of current waterfowl hunters have never contacted an elected official or government about wetlands or waterfowl conservation. That's really appalling to me. And as a waterfowl hunter, we got to do a better job than this. This is horrible. And when you look at some of these other things too, in terms of being able to change things, we can actually do. We're doing a poor job in the waterfowl world. Well, with just less waterfowl hunters out there, these numbers are not going to improve, or just the sheer numbers. You can maybe overcome this with a lot more people. But there's kind of two messages with this, is that we need to do a better job what we're doing right now. And if we lose more people, that's just less support we're going to have out there. And again, same deal, folks. When we have reduced influence, reduced conservation, populations, hunter numbers. So what I'm seeing with those last two things in terms of habitat and people and so forth, we're still going to have this triangle at some point, but what we're going to see is just a smaller triangle out there. So we're still going to probably have this connection and some out there. It's not like all the waterfowl habitat's going to disappear, or all the ducks are going to disappear, or all the hunters are going to disappear. It's just going to be a lot fewer of those. And to drive it home again, what that means then too, if we have that going on, is probably with these reduced waterfowl hunters, we are going to see again a lot more reduced funding and support for monitoring and research programs. A lot of things that we're currently doing, aerial surveys, banding, research projects, all those are going to have just reduced support, just because the money's not there, or the interest is not there, or if you will, there's not a big fire associated with it. So I think we may see some of that going on. What this all is going to accumulate down to at some point, one scenario that I see potentially with fewer waterfowl hunters out there is that, in terms of regulations, it would almost be simpler for the Fish and Wildlife Service and maybe the flyways, maybe not so much the flyways or the states, but you could basically set some pretty restrictive regulations and turn it loose. And if you set restrictive regulations, you don't need to necessarily have to have all the monitoring programs and all the information out there to do that. You can set them low, and the risk to harming a population becomes a lot less. And that's where I ultimately see it going, is that it's just or at least one scenario is that we're going to have pretty short seasons with pretty small bag limits and just let it go. And whatever happens, if populations come back up or down or go back up and we could have more hunting opportunity, that probably won't happen. They'd probably just be sitting there at restrictive regulations. And again, just one scenario that could happen. The one that probably concerns me even more than that, though, is who's going to get the waterfowl hunt when that becomes, if that is something that happens. And not, again, as I mentioned, not all the habitat's going to go, not all the ducks are going to go, and not all the hunters are going to go, but who is going to be left? Right now, we live under the North American model where everybody has, quote, the right and the freedom to waterfowl hunt. And I worry a little bit when numbers get low, habitats get low, what's going to happen with that? We're going to lose some management out there. And hunting is pretty effective when you're talking about like things like nuisance Canada geese and being able to control them. And those are going to be handled differently. And if they are, again, what you see is this kind of feedback loop is that you're going to reduce the number of hunters out there. A curious one is what's going to happen to conservation organizations. And again, one scenario could be that the same thing we've seen before, reduce habitat populations than hunters. One thing here that and why I throw up Ducks Unlimited Canada is because some of this stuff in terms of hunter numbers has happened in Canada, and we haven't necessarily seen, or it's been hard to document if we've seen some of that in Canada. And I'll circle back to DU Canada and what that's meant for them, but we still see some conservation measures being put on the ground in Canada. And so some of these conservation organizations may survive and some may not. Not all is lost. I think there's some things that are going on right now in terms of ecological goods and services that people are becoming more and more aware of, particularly in terms of like carbon storage, flood abatement, and so forth. We're seeing these in Canada for sure. And again, we may just see waterfowl hunting maintained just at reduced levels. Maybe some of the same things are there. And again, what's happened in Canada with kind of this waning support is DU Canada has now become probably a little bit stronger in one way, in the fact that it's looked to in terms of some of these issues with wetlands and wetland conservation and what it means. And kind of ironically, Ducks Unlimited, they're obviously still focused on ducks, but they're really pushing, wetland, the benefits to society of wetlands and doing a lot more on that rather than looking to the duck hunter. So we'll see what happens there. But if that happens here in the US, again, we're still maintaining some wetlands out there and some ducks. And again, there's a lot of R3 efforts going on, and we'll see where those are all going. One thing I did want to mention, one of the things that's happening right here in Nebraska that people are probably aware of, one thing is these 2-tier hunting waterfowl regulations that was directly aimed at kind of this R3 effort and doing some things maybe on a larger scale than it's been done before. But just as an example of things that are being tried and attempted to kind of maintain waterfowl hunter numbers. And the final thing is, if you are a waterfowl hunter and listening in today, you need to be aware of these issues, and you need to do your own R3, and the way I call it is R4. You need to really replace yourself. You need to make sure that someone's going to take your spot in the duck blind in 10, 20 years. And I think what we're going to see is a whole different demographic of waterfowl hunters out there, maybe in 10, 15 years than we're seeing currently now, which are mainly Caucasian males out there. I think we're going to see a change in that. And again, the other thing, I think waterfowl hunters need to step up their game in terms of involvement or their actions in terms of some political nature or supporting conservation measures. With that, I hope I've left some time for some questions. I'd be glad to take any questions anybody may have. So
it's a very good presentation. Enjoyed it. Very educational. We'll stay on for a little bit longer. If anybody has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or the Q&A, or you can always also reach out to Conservation Nebraska. Looks like we have one. What is the best way to bring more hunters in?
Well, the best way right now that we're aware of is that you need to take somebody waterfowl hunting, and not just one time, but multiple times. And I think that's still, hunters make hunters, and that's still the best way that we know at this juncture to make another waterfowl hunter. So start taking people out and keep taking them out.
Anyone who is still left, you should see a feedback survey that's popped up on your screen. It is definitely optional, but it does help us do better for future events and continue to provide events. So feel free to fill it out or not. Up to you. Again, it is optional. If anyone has any questions, again, feel free to drop them in the chat or the for current hunters that are interested in helping continue the tradition, or for those interested in hunting that don't know where to start, someone said check out Hunter Mentor Pledge by Pheasants Forever.
Yep, that's a good one.
Are there efforts to pump water into rainwater basins? Are there any plans for that?
Well, not now since it's all froze up, but I don't know what's on tap for the spring, if that's what you're inquiring about, or or maybe from this past fall, but that's out of my realm of knowledge at this point, what's being planned or has been planned.
What specific waterfowl are most at risk with less conservation efforts?
Well, when you look at some of those species that are really habitat specific, and the one that comes to mind right away to me, and because the populations aren't that big anyway, is the canvasback. Boy, you're starting to see some, maybe big drops in canvasbacks, and that one, again, their population levels aren't that big to begin with. That you could see a real hammer of those, and we've seen pintails and lesser scaup struggle here over the last couple decades, and pintail's another one where you kind of go, oh boy, that's probably not good. But all of them, depending on where and what you're talking about, all of them are going to take a hit. When you start losing habitat, when you're talking grasslands, wetlands, all ducks use those, they're all going to take a hit. Can I ask a question of the panelists or the audience?
Yeah, most definitely.
How many of you remember the good old days of opening day of pheasant season? I'm just curious to know the demographic here that's watching, but the good old days. So
if it's any consolation, I have heard lots of stories from my great uncles and aunts about the good old days.
Yeah, see, there you go. Same here, even better days than I'd seen. So
is there a special training you need to take for waterfowl?
No, there is not. And that's actually one of the things that we've found out about waterfowl hunting, is that it's a little bit more equipment heavy than maybe some other forms. If you're talking upland game bird hunting, you can grab a shotgun, a box of shells, and you can walk out the door with your hunting license and go. When you're going waterfowl hunting, you got a few more permits and stuff to buy. You can't grab any box of shells. You got to buy non-toxic shells. You got to get decoys. You need waders. So the equipment's a little bit heavier. So it's not, the training isn't necessarily there, but there are nuances of how to do things. All forms of hunting have that, but I think it's a little bit more challenging for waterfowl hunting. And again, one reason for two tiers, one of the things that I think quotes a lot of people back is duck identification, and people don't want to get into trouble. And that can be a real challenge for people that are really new to waterfowl hunting. Yeah, loss of habitat mostly to blame. Yeah, with pheasants, boy, there's no silver bullet into that. There's just a lot of bullets flying at pheasants. No pun intended there. Habitat for sure has been, and it always with any waterfowl or wildlife population, when they start to decline, that's the first place you start looking is what's out there for habitat. And it's a little bit more maybe subtle than that. Again, when you recall when you were going out with your uncle and dad back in those days, when I was going out, what I remember is a lot of wheat fields, a lot of sorghum fields. When I first started, I don't remember hardly even seeing a soybean field or a cornfield. And, again, I grew up in Southeast Nebraska. And there's some subtle changes that we've seen, not only just the amount of habitat out there, but what's out there even now. And some of this has changed a lot as well. My dad, he would talk about pick cornfields to shoot pheasants. And I can't imagine today you'd want to walk through any cornfield to try to shoot a pheasant. But he talked about, and they were that weedy. Well, things have changed with that. There's some other things out there that you kind of got to look at and just wonder if that's had some sort of impact. And they probably all had. And I think the number of pheasants is just a death by 1,000 cuts from a lot of things. But
What is your favorite game bird to eat?
ooh, sandhill crane. Sandhill crane. If you've never, I highly recommend going someplace, North Dakota, South Dakota, Texas. I've been to Saskatchewan. Boy, sandhill crane's hard to beat.
What kind of goose are typical to hunt in Nebraska? Are the populations bigger than ducks?
The populations are not bigger typically, but Canada geese in this state are found statewide. If you can get around and look for flocks, you can probably get on a flock of Canada geese somewhere. Highly recommend you kind of get away from some of the cities and stuff where there's a lot of competition, but there's a lot of Canada geese in the state that you can get onto. They're kind of a challenge to hunt, just given, they've got their patterns and they're tough to go, but Canada geese, there's enough of them to chase. I see, Nebraska regular crane season, boy, I don't ever see that happening. And the reason behind that to a large extent is just the political rancor that would cause is just incredible. And what I should have done this when I was still with Game and Parks, but back in 1985, there was a Nebraskan Sportsman's Council, if anybody remembers that one. But there's a group of hunters that would come, and they wanted the commission to look into it and just look into it. And the word got out. There's a file that I used to have in there that was about an inch and a half, 2 inches thick of negative reaction to just the thought of that. And for what we'd shoot for sandhill cranes in this state, it ain't worth the political backlash. And so I just don't see it happening. And in this day and age, it's just tough to kind of get that done. It would take some really people with some pretty strong skin to do that.
It's what was it? The average cost for viewing, the average revenue cost for viewing the crane was $26, but in, was it Oklahoma or like Kansas where you could hunt them, they brought in more revenue? Is that correct? Or am I remembering that incorrectly?
Boy, Olivia, I haven't seen the numbers on that. I just know the for some of those local places that crane hunting is pretty popular. It probably brings in, a fair amount of money. I know just and part of this, it's unrelated to a large extent to a crane season, is, you know, everybody here in the state associates them with the spring migration, and economically in that Kearney, Grand Island area in there, that is by far one of the biggest revenue generators, is that spring migration and people coming from all over the world to come witness that. And that is a huge economic driver. And you'll even in some of this, well, a lot of it, some of the, again, the letters in opposition to anything about considering a crane season was kind of centered on that. And again, it's a little misplaced, but you had city councils and people like that kind of saying, don't do it.
This person said, I grew up in the 70s. My dad took us duck hunting. I'm not a hunter, but missed time in the blind. The new generation needs to get back to nature to experience it. There are fishing clinics that take teenagers or anyone out interested to streams and rivers. Is this a possibility for getting new waterfowl hunters if a program would be started?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's how you can do that program. I would even just getting him to go sit in a blind and watch how things kind of operate. I mean, you still want him to kind of participate to get in that, but it's a matter of trying to have spots and blinds and things kind of set up to go do that. And again, you can do it. It's possible. It's just kind of one of those things logistically, it's kind of difficult to work through. Probably the biggest problem with that, and it would probably generate a few hunters, is, and what I think one of the biggest hangups with a lot of R3 efforts is the scale. How do you do that to actually make a difference where you're actually increasing numbers of waterfowl hunters out there? But I think the tenet that you have there is getting people back out in the nature and looking and getting out there. That still has to happen, and that still has to be obviously a major point of what you're trying to do, is getting them out there, connect with nature that they may not ever do. So whether it's actually going into a duck blind, in the fall, and probably actually a better time to do it that we haven't really thought about is the springtime, when there isn't an actual hunting season, but you can go sit in the blind. And one of the things I enjoy about, like, I don't hunt snow geese that often or participate in a conservation order, but man, when you're sitting in that blind in a conservation order, you got pintails and everything else flying around and are full color. It's about as much fun to sit there and watch that as it is anything else. And maybe that's something we should do, is get people out there in the springtime and just to see, that going on. And again, you're getting them in the marsh and taking a look at it. So there's something there. It's just, again, logistically and scale wise, tough to do.
Let's see, any last minute questions? I don't see any in the chat or the Q&A. But if anyone does have any questions I didn't get a chance to answer, you can feel free to reach out to Conservation Nebraska. And we can also share other contact information as long as Dr. Vrtiska is okay with that, or even Game and Parks. They also have waterfowl people. They should have a waterfowl person.
They do.
Yeah.
He's there.
But thank you to Dr. Vrtiska for joining us tonight, giving our presentation. We will have another one February 2nd in February on a Tuesday evening. The third part focusing on fish. So if you enjoyed this one or Jackson's presentation, we will have that one coming up as well. Thank you again. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. I hope everyone has a good night, and maybe we'll see you at another event.
Thanks again.
Yep.